true masculinity about him at all. And it's racist to imply that black men just kind of sat back and let all this happen. No, black men didn't. Many times black men killed the adulterer. And I say again, I understand. Black men were sometimes put on trial for doing it and were acquitted when it was learned that in fact they were retaliating because of adultery. Not always was that the case, but it did happen. Now, all these things also in addition, and this is one of the most important points that I want to make, is that they overlook the strength of the slave family. Planners promoted strong families, not merely because it was biblical, which was the motivation for many, but also because that meant if everybody's happy, that's good. That's good for the plantation. And happy families make happy workers. And if I'm an ungodly man, if the only thing I really love is money, I still want happy families. Because happy families make happy workers. Whistle while you work, boys. This is great. We work all day when we're happy. We like to do it. You see, even ungodly men encouraged very strong families. Marriage was encouraged and honored in spite of the abolitionist propaganda that says it was not always honored. No, it wasn't legal under all circumstances, but it was still honored by the masters. Adultery was punished. Divorce was discouraged by the whip. And an adulterer who got caught was in big trouble. Furthermore, slave families were not matriarchal, as we have been told. What abolitionists are doing is looking at the modern black family and assuming that's the way black families have always been. That's racist, incidentally. Because the fact is that the men were the head of their houses under the slave system. The men were men, and the women were women. It's a beautiful thing to see the ladylike femininity of the slave women and the masculinity of the slave men. The husband was the head of the house. There was a strong familial bond. The children were disciplined and well trained. This kind of bond is not the product of promiscuity. One might almost say, and I will say, that the black family has never been stronger than it was under slavery. Someone else says, weren't the living conditions just terrible? Well, let's think about it. The food, for example. The belief that the typical slave was poorly fed is without foundation totally. There was no deficiency in the amount of meat allotted to slaves. On the average, they consumed 6 ounces of meat per day, which is 1 ounce lower than the average quantity of meat consumed by the free population. The high consumption of meat and sweet potatoes and peas made the slave diet not only adequate, but in fact it actually exceeded the recommended daily... I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh at this. But the truth is it exceeded the recommended daily levels of the chief nutrients by a long shot. And again, even unbelieving men, you don't want malnourished men. They can't work. See, this is the contradiction in all of these criticisms should be manifest to us. Even if I am an ungodly man, I want my workers well fed. Because if they're not well fed, they can't work. And if they can't work, I ain't going to make any money. Now you see, let's forget about Christians for a moment, even though I will contend that most of these men were essentially Christian men. And they had other motives aside from just the material. But let's just say they just had material motives. Even a material motive moves you to treat your slaves better than the abolitionists said they were treated. No, they were well fed. Clothing was not lavish, but it was fairly standard for the average white man in the South. And many slaves, truth be told, had far better clothes than poor whites. Shelter, what about their houses? Weren't they just terrible? Well, the most systematic housing information comes from the 1860 census, which included a count of slave houses. These data show that on average there were 5.2 slaves per house. Now, I got more people in my house than that. Mine's a little bigger. But the fact is, the average free household had 5.3 people in it. Single-family housing was the norm. You didn't have 3 and 4 families in a little outhouse kind of building. The average slave house was 18 by 20. They usually had 1 or 2 rooms. Lofts were very common where the children slept. Windows, sometimes even glazed windows, most times windows that were closed with shutters were there. Chimneys were there of brick or stone, not twigs and mud. because those things, of course, burn up, and you don't do things that are dangerous around people that you care about, number one, or people that you've got a big investment in, number two. Building material was either logs or wood, which was common, of course, in all free housing. Floors were planked and raised off the ground. This is the average slave home. They weren't dirt floors because of disease and all the other things. They were planked floors, usually raised off the ground, for all the reasons we do that today. Such housing may sound rather common to modern standards, but actually it compared very well with the homes of free workers in the antebellum era. I have two photographs, and I didn't bring them, but one of them is of a slave house, and the other one is of a normal white, average white citizen's house. They look identical, because in fact, many times the typical slave cabin was a little nicer than the average white family's house in the South. Poor whites were much worse, and some of the slaves in the slave narratives complain because after slavery they say, we're having to live like poor white people. The typical slave cabin contained more sleeping space per person than was available to the working class in New York City in 1900. What about medical care? Well, generally the slaves received the same medical care the family received. The same doctor ministered to the planter's family as ministered to the slave family. Good medical care is reflected in the statistics for life expectancy. U.S. slaves had much longer life expectancy than free urban industrial workers in the North and in Europe. The life expectancy of a Southern slave was far, far longer because they were treated better than Northern industrial workers and European workers. Now, okay, given those facts, let's return now and say, what were the problems of slavery? Well, the Southerners were very quick to say, slavery is attended with many evils. It is not of itself an evil, but it is attended with many evils. What they were saying was slavery is a righteous institution, it is a biblical institution when it operates biblically. Unfortunately, Southern slavery did not operate biblically at every point. And so it was not perfect and was worthy of criticism. But you see, too often the problems of slavery are not the problems we've been told about. Let me just mention a few of the problems. Obviously, we should be quick, and Christians in the South have always been quick to notice those discrepancies between biblical slavery and Southern slavery. Those differences make an unqualified defense of the institution as it existed and operated in the South impossible. We cannot defend it because of its unbiblical characteristics. Furthermore, the cruel mistreatment given to some slaves is inexcusable, and I will say despicable, and I denounce the whole thing. That mistreatment was reprobated, however, by the majority of Southern slave owners and Southerners in general. All of this sort of thing that occurred was wicked, it was indefensible, we will not defend it. Thirdly, and this is the worst thing in my view about slavery, was the fact that slavery promoted what we can call a slave mentality in the minds of most blacks, and unfortunately that has not been eradicated to this day. Not everyone was affected this way. The truth is that many Southern blacks were very industrious, amazing stories about their ingenuity. I think now of a man who was a very prominent artisan and sought after all over the South for his work. And many Southern homes to this day, if they're still standing, have work done by this particular slave, a master craftsman. And he was a very wealthy man because his master allowed him to travel all the time. And he would also pay his master a proportion to kind of pay him back, because he never worked at the plantation, or when he did work at the plantation, he was paid for that. But then he traveled all over the South doing work, and his master allowed it. There were many stories like that of very industrious, brilliant, gifted black men, and I wish those were the men that were honored in Black History Month. And I wish those were the men that had a day named after them, not the man that has a day named after them. It's demeaning to blacks to have that man as a hero. But there are many men who are worthy of our honor, and I will give them honor. Not everyone imbibed the slave mentality, but I have to say most of them did. And this is the saddest thing. Why is it that most of the people who are interviewed in the slave narratives wish that they were back in slavery? You see, that is problematic to me. I mean, that does indicate something about how how attractive their life was. But it makes me sad that they want to be slaves again, you see? They shouldn't. And ironically, if slavery had not been so pleasant an experience, they wouldn't have wanted to be back in it. But you see, the fact, and this is the strange thing, because planners tried to do what I think Christian men ought to do, that made slavery not an unattractive option. They didn't do, in other words, the failure of the South is seen more in this than any other area. They did not train these people to live as responsible men.